Welcome back to Meet in the Middle. I'm Christine Brown, and we're talking with a couple of the scientists out at PNNL about all the various kinds of research that they're doing, and we're only focusing on two topics. One was national security. The one we're going to look at right now is energy. My guest is Mike Rinker, and Mike was kind to tell me that our children went to school together and we live in the same neighborhood. And there's so many connections. It's a small town, isn't it, Mike?
It is a very small town. It's a small world.
It is a small world, but obviously I keep running into people who like this world and like living here for lots of different reasons. And I'm going to think that working out at PNNL, just like Bob was stating, is a pretty good reason to live here.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah. What is your title there and your focus of energy?
So my title out at the laboratory right now, I manage our energy efficiency and renewable energy portfolio. So that includes everything from the business development aspects that we're doing across that whole portfolio to helping with our relationship with our sponsors as well as with the staff, so we kind of make all those connections.
So are you similar to national security, where your primary relationship for funding is coming from the U.S. government, or are you also doing private contracts?
So I would say the vast majority of the work that we're doing in energy is with the Department of Energy, and in my area with energy efficiency, renewable energy, that's certainly the case. Although we do some private contracting through various efforts with private industry, if they want to team with us on something or they want to work with us because we have a unique capability set to bring to their problem, they'll ask us to help them out, and we can do that.
Mm-hmm. All right, so let's talk about transportation. And
sure.
What are you doing to help us save energy in transportation?
Sure. If you look at transportation in the United States, if what we're trying to do is look for new ways of trying to reduce our dependence on foreign oil. So there's a lot of different ways to do that. And we're working in several of those ways. But for example, if I can save maybe 10% of the weight of a car, or 10% of a piece of the weight of the car, I can make it more efficient by maybe 6 to 8% of that car. So we're doing things in terms of what we call lightweighting. How can we take some of the weight out of the car? As an example, one of the technologies that we've recently put into commercialization, working with a couple of companies, is a technology called friction stir welding, where we've been able to join two pieces of metal, and we don't use the traditional welding techniques, which actually melts the metal and actually causes a bit of a weakness in the material there. We're using a different process where you're actually using a friction and just really almost mashing the material together so that it retains its original properties, and therefore you can make the same strength of a part, or you can put together different thicknesses of materials that you couldn't do before. So as an example, on a car door, your car door is pretty heavy, and part of the reason it's heavy over there by the hinge, because that's where a lot of the force and such, the weight gets held up, and so you may not need the same strength of material out there by the handle. And so if I could have two different materials, one thick where it's needed and one thin where it's needed, then I can actually save some weight. So we worked with a couple of companies, including one of the major automotive manufacturers, to actually be able to do that, where we're now stamping door parts after we've done this friction stir process, or this ability to mash these pieces together so that we can actually save weight in the door, and then it makes the vehicle more efficient.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're certainly getting a lot more efficient vehicles today. I mean, typically people are talking about getting 21 to 28 miles per gallon now. Is that going to continue to move up?
It is absolutely going to continue to move up. In fact, as the standards change, you're having increasing efficiency standards for the fleet, if you will, from the automotive perspective, and we're also getting some more stringent requirements on emissions. So as you start to increase those emissions requirements and try to be more efficient, what happens is the automotive companies have to develop new engine technologies in order to make that work. So what's happening is they're in the process of what we call a lean burn engine. So they're trying to make these engines more efficient, trying to use every bit of heat and stuff out of the combustion process to make that engine more efficient. So what's happened, for example, is what we're starting to see in cars that are going to be coming out in the next few years is the exhaust systems are actually going to be operating at a much lower temperature. Well, what does that mean? Typically in exhaust systems you use catalyst materials to help reduce the emissions and the type of particulate you're trying to take out. Well, those catalysts only work at certain temperature ranges. And if we reduce the temperature of the gases coming out the back, because we're being so efficient with the engine, we're going to have to develop new catalyst materials in order to take care of those emissions coming out the back end. So, you know, those are some of the good things coming out of these more efficient standards, but it's going to continue to ratchet up every 5 years or so.
Are you doing anything that has to do with electric cars?
We are. So, electric cars, of course, are quite expensive, but using battery technologies, they have a very limited range in terms of how far they can travel on a given charge. So we're looking at new chemistries for battery systems to see if we can, improve the amount of time you could go between charges. So you could maybe get from here to Seattle rather than having to stop once or twice to get to Seattle with an electric car. We also know that there's a lot of charging stations at the laboratory, and there's a lot of charging stations around, and we're also looking at ways of how we can make those charging stations more efficient, more make them faster, so you can have faster charging and those sorts of things.
I haven't seen too many here around the Tri-Cities at all, but I thought it was pretty interesting to see two sitting in front of McDonald's in Ellensburg. So maybe that is the in-between point between Spokane and Seattle?
Well, they may have to have several cups of coffee if they were going to do a full charge.
Okay, yeah. All right. What about biofuels and mixing with our fossil fuel?
Sure. So biofuels are something that we're also working on. In fact, the facility here at PNNL, we have a facility that we have worked with Washington State University. So we're actually on campus with the folks from Washington State University. We've been working with them in a partnership for about 10 years. So a lot of our staff and lab space is over there. But we're looking at all kinds of ways of taking different, if you will, biomass or bio waste products, everything from algae to crop residue to solid municipal waste. How can we convert some of those carbons into actual fuels? And so some of the things that we're working on right now is looking at different chemical routes, whether it be through high temperature or through catalysts and other methods of actually getting to those things like diesel fuel and jet fuel. As an example, we've been working with several companies to look at bio-based jet fuel that you could mix with traditional jet fuel for commercial aircraft. In fact, two of the companies we've been working with, we're actually going to be having some of the fuel will be on commercial aircraft here in the next several months this fall.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about building energy, because it seems like for most of us, we think about the use of energy in our car and also in our homes. What's
Right.
going on there?
So buildings, of course, take a huge amount of electricity that this country produces, and so we're working in a number of different areas within the building technologies portfolio. So one of the things that has really been successful for us is something you may not hear about a lot, but we're very involved with the Department of Energy on building energy codes. So as you build new buildings, what kind of energy codes should they be putting into new buildings to make them more efficient? And then how can we get those codes adopted by the various communities around the United States? Because every state has a different way of looking at energy codes and building energy codes. So we work pretty closely with the department to develop those codes. In fact, if you look at over the last several decades, and what we've done some calculations in terms of actual energy savings, and we're well over $3 billion of energy savings right now, and over the next 10-15 years it'll probably be upwards of $10 to $20 billion of savings based on these new energy codes that we're working with the department.
Oh, okay. At some point down the road, will we see solar panels on most homes or little small windmills on most? I mean,
Well, you're
what will
actually
we
starting.
see?
Yeah, you're starting to see that in a number of places. California, for example, you're seeing a lot more of what we call rooftop units of solar cells on buildings in California. In fact, there are some people, and time will tell, but there are some people who believe that within the next several years that California will actually will be exporting energy as opposed to importing energy. Traditionally, they've always imported energy from some of the power that we make here on the Columbia River system, but they'll actually be exporting energy in the next several years based on the number of solar panels that they've got. Windmills. Windmills are obviously another distributed form of energy production, and there's a lot of things going on with windmills right now. For example, one of the efforts that we're working on with several of the other national labs is looking what we call from atmosphere to electrons. So if you have a wind farm out there and you really want to try to optimize that wind farm and really try to maximize the amount of energy that you're producing out of that farm, one of the things that we're looking at is from our expertise in atmospheric sciences that we have at PNNL, we're trying to understand as that atmosphere gets, if you will, gets closer and closer to the actual wind farm, what is happening with the wind as it flows through, and how can we actually optimize that farm?
Mm-hmm. All right,
Wow.
we've had wind people on before, so wind is just a fascinating topic, and we see so many of the structures around here. We're going to take a break here, but I also want to talk with you a little bit, Mike, when we come back about balancing fish needs and fish passage with hydro energy. So that will be another topic for us. Our phone number, 547-8726. We're back in a moment. Mike Rinker is my guest. He focuses on energy-related research at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. Mike, what I think is kind of interesting in listening to you talk is that if we hadn't as a nation forced ourselves, and I know that a lot of people have done that very reluctantly for these new fuel standards and pushing us to find the technology, but forcing us and automakers to do it, we wouldn't have done it. We would still be backwards trying to, we'd be rationing fuel right now. I don't know.
We'd be importing a lot more foreign oil.
Sometimes we have to force ourselves. Another one of those issues, I guess, is the difference, or not difference, but balancing fish and hydroelectricity needs. How are you working in that area?
Yeah, that's been a long-going area of interest for the laboratory and for the region, of course, for many, many years in terms of trying to balance the salmon passage through the tortuous system of the Columbia River, and then also trying to balance that against this cheap hydropower that we enjoy here compared to the rest of the nation. So how do you really balance that? So there have been concerns about the young salmon flowing through the dams and getting down to the Pacific Ocean, and what kind of mortality there was. So as we've been going through, for example, we've been trying to understand what happens to a fish as it goes through a turbine. So one of the things that we've looked at very closely, we've developed certain sensors, if you will, and we call them sensor fish. They're fake fish with sensors in them that we actually run through some of these turbines to try to get an understanding of what's happening in terms of things like accelerations and pressures and those sorts of things. And one of the things that we have found is a lot of, some of the fish kill, if you will, through the turbines was through what we call barotrauma, or a very quick change of pressure that the fish's swim bladder can't take, and essentially the fish dies very quickly. And so are there ways of trying to mitigate that? So we're working both with the Army Corps of Engineers as well as the Bonneville Power Administration and the Department of Energy to really try to address those sorts of problems. So we're looking at, number one, how do we design the next set of turbines that they could be fish friendly? And so between the experimental work that we've done trying to understand what's going on as fish go through the turbine, and working with the turbine manufacturers, we've been looking at how can we reduce this pressure change, and how can you design the turbine so that you minimize that pressure change, so the fish that go through the actual turbine can make it without getting harmed. And so we're starting to see a lot of modeling efforts based on our experimental work, and we're providing that to industry so that they can look at the next generation of turbines and make a difference. At the same time, we're trying to work with the turbine manufacturers to say, well, these turbines that are out in the Columbia River now have been out there for nearly 50 years, and they're ready for replacement. So how can we also provide them with the type of guidelines and understanding so that they could actually create turbines that are also more efficient, and maybe so that you can actually balance fish with the turbines. You know, the other thing that we're doing is we actually do put sensors in baby fish, if you will. We're actually we tag about 50,000 baby fish every year, and then we put them into the river, and we also try to track where they go. Some of them go through the turbines, some of them go through other trajectories through the dam system, and so we're trying to track that and understand what their behaviors are, and are there other ways that we can mitigate you know, any of the potential impacts to them, so we can maximize the survivability rate, so that we can enjoy the salmon coming back upstream, you know, several years later when they come back to spawn.
Well, we've got to have fish, and we've got to have energy. Two very difficult things to balance. And what about the energy ties to Hanford? Do you have similar heritage as National Security does?
Sure. You know, as Bob talked earlier about, you know, the fact that the lab had its roots in the Hanford side. We on the energy side, we also do as well. One of the things, you know, for things like the fish passage and those sorts of things, what we're really trying to look at and trying to address are what are these environmental impacts, or how can we understand the impacts on the environment from some of these technologies and try to mitigate that either after they've been built, like in the case of the dams, or for future energy, things like marine hydrokinetic power, for example. How can we mitigate what could potentially happen and make sure we address those environmental concerns beforehand? So a lot of that environmental work came out of the work that we had started with Hanford. You know, and another area that's been very fruitful for us that really has its roots back into Hanford is the subsurface. So, as you know, the concerns out at the Hanford site, one of the concerns is these plumes of radioactive material moving through the soil. So we've done a lot of modeling over the years to try to understand that. Well, we've taken some of those models and also are using them to try to understand other parts of the geology and what's going on underneath the surface, for example, for fracking, and understanding things in terms of things like geothermal wells. If you want to exploit geothermal for power, how can we understand that better by using some of these technologies that were developed, you know, in conjunction with Hanford Cleanup, and use those for actually energy use.
Well, we're learning today that it's massive, the kind of research that's going on at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, and to think that all this is happening in our backyard. It's really exciting. Thank you both. I really appreciate your time here today, Mike Rinker and Bob Runkle. Very much appreciate what you've shared with us today. We're back in just a moment. Stay with us.